Thank you. Okay, can everybody see this okay? Excellent, people are nodding, great. Thanks so much, Erin, and like Erin said, I'm really grateful to have gotten to connect with her really recently, and we got to nerd out with one another about relational frame theory and the implicit relational assessment procedure, which I might touch on a little bit later on. But yeah, the BH3 Inc. are amazing, and I'm sad that I didn't know about them before now, but just the things that they do is really wonderful. And I mean, even the concept of giving people or paying for people certification, how incredible. So thank you so much, Erin, and yeah, you guys for everything that you do. So without further ado, let's talk about ACT and RFT. This is my first time to present sitting down and just in my own living room. So forgive me if there are any hiccups, but hopefully it'll go smoothly enough. I also don't really know the level of exposure that any of the participants have had or have not had to ACT and RFT. So I took a little bit of a conservative approach, so I hope that's okay, just kind of walking everybody through from start to finish to try and get a good comprehensive understanding of why these two amazing technologies are so important in ABA. And just a little bit about myself. I have been a BCBA since a BCBAD since 2012. I come from Ireland, and I've moved over to the United States in 2013, and I'm in Colorado, and I work for a wonderful nonprofit organization called Firefly Autism. And I know I have a couple of fellow Fireflies on here, so thanks for your support. Okay. So, Erin, for some reason, oh, never mind. Here we go. Okay, there we go. Got it. I knew there'd be at least one hiccup. Okay, so ACT and RFT are part of what's comprised of as third wave behavioral therapies. So if anybody's familiar, first wave behavioral therapies were pretty much made up of just behaviorism, right? Operant conditioning, classical conditioning. And the second wave was comprised of cognitive behavioral therapy. Now the second wave broke away from the first because purely operant and classical conditioning didn't really account for cognition. And then the third wave of behavioral therapy, which is what we're all familiar with, broke away from the second because there was too much of an emphasis on cognition and no emphasis on behavior, so to speak. So what we're left with is a behavioral therapy that's rooted in contextual behavioral science, right? So that is how important context is. All behavior occurs in a context and has a purpose. So dependent on the context, thoughts or actions can either be normal or problematic. And that's kind of the basis of where we come from. And we're called radical behavior analysts. And I'm sure I have probably everybody on here would identify as a radical behavior analyst. But that's what that means. So when we think about acceptance and commitment therapy, what we're thinking of is a technology that teaches people to increase awareness of their own behavior, both public and private, and to notice how it functions in the context of their life, right? So does it improve my life, or does it, lower the quality of my life? And there are a couple of things that are very intricately tied to acceptance and commitment therapy. The first thing we just discussed, functional contextualism, right? So contextual behavioral psychology, which is basically a focus on behavior in its context. I'm going to say the word context a lot, but it is really important to remember that that's what we're talking about, okay? The other thing is relational frame theory. So I think there's almost a misconception that RFT came first and ACT came afterwards, but that's not actually technically true. Both of them have kind of been developing together over about the last 25 years. And really the progression has been in an effort to expand the reach of behavior analysis. So as we know, RFT is the behavioral account of human language and cognition. And then, of course, the other crucial piece, applied behavior analysis. So in ABA, we study any variable that affects the probability of behavior. So if we think about that for a second, any variable that affects the probability of behavior. So that includes things that might not be able to be seen. So there might be some covert things that happen that still affect our overt behavior. So from my perspective, it's almost a responsibility of behavior analysts to really think about this, because think about those things that still drive our overt behavior but might be covert processes. So what's the point? What's the point in us knowing all of these things and having a deeper understanding? Well, we know really well how to deal with something like this, right? So we're really well equipped if we have somebody throwing a tantrum and it's significantly impacting their ability to learn or significantly impacting their family's life. That's something that we know pretty well how to deal with as behavior analysts. But what if the behavior looks like this? These are still, so a behavior where I have somebody, and this is a real client of mine, someone who hasn't left their house for 8 months, and their ability to learn, their ability to take in information, their quality of life is significantly impacted by these types of behaviors. And these are overt behaviors, right? But they're not as easy for us as behavior analysts to address. And that's where the issue is. So what we want to do is we want to say, I now have the tools in my toolbox to be able to deal with something like this, not just something that is kind of more standard for behavior analysis. So what do you really need to know? Because if you start delving into relational frame theory, you could read for probably the next year and fall down rabbit holes left, right, and center and be really confused. And then you haven't even started thinking about acceptance and commitment therapy yet. So hopefully within the next 40 minutes or so, or 50 minutes or so, we'll just talk about the things that you really need to know, and you'll walk away with a grasp of the essentials. That's my aim. So one of the things that's really important to think about when we're starting the process of understanding relational frame theory specifically is stimulus equivalence. Sidman, thank you so much to Sidman. He did an awful lot for us. He was the man who started the ball rolling with all of this. So just very quick recap. Hopefully everybody remembers their basics in ABA and stimulus equivalence. So reflexivity, symmetry, transitivity is if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, the participant will derive that C is equal to A. And here we have our first presentation of the derive word. And we talk about that a lot in RFT as well. So just a really quick example. If I show you this picture of this gorgeous fluffy animal, you know that that is the spoken word dog. And you would also know that it equals the written word dog. But you can also backwards identify that as well, right? So if I just showed you this, you would be able to read that word and say dog. And you would also know that it equals to this gorgeous picture of a dog. So stimulus equivalence was really important. But it didn't necessarily account, or it doesn't necessarily account for how complex language is. And we think about being part of a wave of behavior analysis where context is really important. Stimulus equivalence didn't quite account for context. And there's an awful lot of other things that come into complex language as well, right? Like rules, metaphor, and culture. And there's this one study that was done in the early 90s. And in my mind, it was, when I read the study, it was just this mind-blowing moment where I was like, now I get it. Now I understand why stimulus equivalence just doesn't quite account for complex language and context. And to give a little bit of background, so the study was done with Northern Irish and English participants. And for those of you who are not aware, Ireland is split into two. So the north of Ireland still belongs to the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Ireland is its own independent state. In Northern Ireland, in the early 1900s, there was an awful lot of fighting because the Republic of Ireland, or Ireland, was trying to get independence from England. So basically, after all was said and done, the Republic of Ireland had independence, but the north of Ireland was still a part of the United Kingdom. And there was a mix of Protestants and Catholics. The Catholic religion is closely tied to the Republic of Ireland. The Protestant religion is closely tied to the British. So there was an awful lot of fighting over basically being either Protestant or Catholic. There was lots of bombings. There was a lot of unrest for years and years. Now the history lesson is over, I promise. But it's important to get that context. So what these researchers did was they were doing a basic equivalence training, right? They trained participants to match Catholic family names to a nonsense syllable, and then match that nonsense syllable to a Protestant symbol. And what they wanted to do was show transitivity, right? So they wanted to show that C is equal to A. They conducted the equivalence test. So the vast majority, actually I think all of the English participants passed the equivalence test. But because of the years and years and years of context and history and culture and all of these really, really strong things in Northern Ireland, the Northern Irish participants literally could not match the Catholic symbol with the Protestant family names. They just couldn't do it. So basically what the researchers showed was that these verbal relations, and these are verbal relations, right? It's literally me saying, I am this thing, and this symbol equals what I am, disrupted the ability to form laboratory-induced equivalence relations. So it showed that equivalence relations could go so far, but it still doesn't account for the complexities of language. I hope everyone else's mind is as blown as mine was when I when I first read that study. So that's where relational frame theory comes in. So RFT is, according to Steve Hayes, it basically integrates all of these different phenomena, right? Equivalence, naming, understanding, analogy, metaphor, rule following, and accounts for all of those things within its framework. And it is complicated for sure. So this is a really nice kind of an example of relational framing that I'm going to show you guys here. So, and this is a psychologist in Colorado, Dr. Sean Smith. He wrote a blog and was very kind to let me take his example to kind of show, because it's just a really good way of showing how much we can derive relations. So let's say we bump into each other at our annual Firefly conference in Colorado, typically in February. That's my plug. And I introduce you to my brother Leroy and my dad Rupert. So you have these two pieces of information. What you do is your brain will derive 4 additional relationships, right? And the blue arrows will show the additional relationships that you'll derive. So you'll derive, I am Leroy's brother, I'm Rupert's son, Leroy is Rupert's son, probably. Okay, so there's a little bit of inferring. So we're making inferences here with relational framing a little bit. Then later on, I'll introduce you to my mom Consuela and my niece Miranda. And given 2 more really small pieces of information, you will derive all of these relationships, all of these extra relationships, which is a lot, right? You can see here, so Consuela is my brother's mother, Miranda is my brother's daughter, Rupert is Miranda's grandfather, etc., etc., etc. So that's what deriving relations looks like. So we're given really small pieces of information, and then we derive lots and lots of relationships from that. And it's backwards and forwards deriving. And what you'll notice about this is this isn't equivalence, right? This is not an equivalence relation. This is part of a family of relational frames that we'll talk about in a little bit. This is a hierarchical relation. So that's how we take it a step further to say we're not talking about equals to here. We're talking about different relationships between stimuli. So the relational framing is prone to some errors, as we said. But from an early age, we're basically shown these multiple exemplars of the same types of relationships until we learn how to recognize them by ourselves. Okay, so different families of relational frames, and these are super important to kind of get a grasp of or remember as well. Believe me, if you get into this a lot, you'll literally start to see conversations in terms of relational frames. You're like, oh, there's a frame of comparison. So frames of coordination are things like identity and sameness, frames of opposition, pretty self-explanatory opposites. Frames of distinction is a lack of coordination along a particular dimension, so basically one thing as distinguished from another. Frames of comparison, like bigger and smaller. Hierarchical frames, family trees are a really good example of hierarchical frames actually. They can be a little bit on the complicated side. So they can get big and very complex pretty quickly, but it basically means classes that contain members on different levels. So that's what we mean when we're talking about hierarchical frames. Dyactic frames are also very, very important to remember and to think about. And I think when we get into talking more about acceptance and commitment therapy, the dyactic frames are ones that we talk about quite a bit. So dyactic frames is the perspective of the speaker. So think about here and there, I and you, and now and then. So if I'm talking about myself in the past, that's a dyactic frame because I'm relating, there's myself in this relationship to the past and what I've done in the past. Same with the future, now, then, etc., etc. There are a bunch of other families of relational frames, spatial, temporal, causal frames, etc., etc. And the thing about relational frames is that there's no real limit to the possibility of what constitutes a family of relational frames because it's only limited by our verbal repertoire. So if we say something is the same as, then that's a relational frame. So basically our own verbal repertoire is the only thing that limits what can be constituted as a family of relational frames. So beyond the families of relational frames, the properties of relational frames are really important. So when we talk about properties of relational frames, we're specifically talking about these three things. So mutual entailment means that if A is related to B, then B is also related to A, right? So you can kind of almost think of that mutual entailment like symmetry. If you're really, really into stimulus equivalence, you can kind of see that the connection between the two. Combinatorial entailment, if A is related to B and B is related to C, then A is related to C. And then our third one, which is one of our most crucial, is transformation of stimulus function. And what that means is if two stimuli are related, the functions of each are transformed just by virtue of their relationship. Now let me show you an example. So let's say I really love going for a walk and I really love walking in a forest nearby. I really like when the trees rustle, it's really peaceful, the water makes me feel really calm. And then one day somebody tells me, hey Amanda, did you know there's bears in that forest? And I'd say, oh, I never heard that. Now, I've never seen a bear in real life. I've never encountered a bear, thankfully. But I know enough about bears to know that I really don't want to meet one or encounter one. So now, my lovely walk in the forest is no longer really calm and really nice. In fact, it's actually quite scary. So just by virtue of a relationship between the forest and somebody telling me, hey, that forest has bears, now the function of the forest has acquired some of the functions of the bear. So the forest has acquired those functions just by virtue of a relationship. And that is the essence of transformation of stimulus function. And believe me when I tell you, transformation of stimulus function becomes so important when we're talking about complex verbal behavior. Because as humans, we relate things like crazy. We relate things all the time. And when we relate one thing to another, the functions of each take on parts of one another, right? So sometimes things that were previously not aversive at all can take on aversive functions just by virtue of the relationship, and that's transformation of stimulus function. So I'm going to do a quick recap of all the crucial points that you need to know about relational frame theory, because I went through that really, really fast. And if I'm talking too fast, please, Erin, let me know if anyone's telling me to talk slower. Thank you. Okay, so relational responding refers to the ability to respond to relations between stimuli rather than just responding to each stimulus separately. Relations between stimuli can be derived, okay? Meaning that the relations need not be directly learned. We derive these relationships. The process of derived relational responding, this occurs with respect to arbitrary stimulus properties. And what I mean by that is we relate things between things not based on any kind of formal property. So not based on how they look or, so for example, nickels and dimes. And I'm sure some of you have heard this example before, but a nickel is, I still always forget this. Like, I moved to this country and was like, I don't know what nickels and dimes are. But a nickel is smaller in value than a dime, but it's a bigger coin. So why is it smaller in value? Well, it's smaller in value just because we said so. So our verbal community assigned something, so a less than relation, to a thing that's physically bigger. But kids will learn really, really quickly that they want the smaller coin because it's worth more, right? Not, they don't want the bigger coin just because it's bigger, because we learn those relationships. So we derive these relational responses with respect to just completely arbitrary things that we make up in our verbal environment, not formal stimulus properties. And that's an important point as well. So this process of arbitrarily applicable derived relational responding, it is that results in transformation of stimulus functions. So we derive relations based on arbitrary things, and these derived relations cause functions of certain stimuli to change based on that relationship. Okay, I hope everybody is still with me. So one of the fundamental concepts in RFT is just that, right? Arbitrarily applicable relational responding, which is really hard to say really fast lots of times in a row. But essentially, arbitrarily applicable relational responding gives rise to complex language. And our complex verbal repertoires are a result of this. But we also have to remember that they're controlled by contextual cues, okay? So if anybody ever asks you to describe relational frame theory, just take this slide and the last slide, put them together, and that's basically it. That's kind of the essentials of everything that you need to know. And everyone will be like, wow, you really know what you're talking about with RFT. Okay. So to illustrate my example just a little bit further, I'm going to ask everybody to look at this picture. And I'm going to ask you to imagine tasting this thing and imagine smelling this thing. And what you come to realize is that you can almost smell, you can almost taste, you can almost feel yourself salivating thinking about the picture that I just showed you. My video gets really weird when I do that, but so a picture, just this simple picture, becomes part of this vast relational network that includes things like smells, tastes, textures, colors. I'm tacting this in my head. Lemon. I know I can almost feel it on my skin. I can think about feelings and memories of lemons, lemon trees, lemon pies, and on and on and on. So literally this one stimulus that I just popped up on the screen is part of a vast relational network, and relational frame theory is what accounts for that. Oops. Okay. So where relational framing starts to, you can kind of see where this is going, right? If we're making really complex relations and thinking about the transfer of stimulus functions, you can see where we can get to a point where we might get in trouble a little bit with our language, right? So let's say the word needle, the object, which we can see here, and the memory of pain are mentally connected, then one can actually evoke the other two. So basically, if someone says to me, oh, you have to go to the doctor and you might get a needle, instantly, not only just with someone saying the word needle, I'm thinking about the actual needle, and I'm also thinking about the last time that I got a needle and it was really sore. And then I'm starting to feel fear, right? Because just by the word, the memory of the pain and the thing itself are in a coordination relation, and one can evoke the other two. So let's say I suffer from panic attacks, and when I have a panic attack, I feel these nervous sensations, right? It's something on the inside. I feel these nervous sensations. And there's this bi-directional relationship between my nervous sensations and my panic attacks. So not only when I'm having a panic attack, I feel these sensations, but also vice versa. So what might start to happen is when I start to feel nervous about something, what my brain will likely start to do would be, oh, wow, I feel really nervous. This is what happens when I get panic attacks. And then I might start engaging in other types of relations, like maybe comparison relations, like, oh, these nervous sensations actually feel a little bit worse than the last nervous sensations that I had. I think I'm definitely going to have a panic attack. And then we have a panic attack because we're thinking about the nervous sensations and how they caused panic attacks. And what can happen is other things can be brought into that frame of coordination. So let's say I get super, super nervous when I meet my in-laws. Maybe they're not really nice to me, or maybe I'm just really nervous meeting them. And I get really nervous when I meet my in-laws. So now the in-laws are in this frame of coordination with nervous sensations, but the nervous sensations are in that frame of coordination with panic. So then maybe what I might start to do is just avoid seeing the in-laws, because I really don't want to feel nervous, because I know that's going to lead to a panic attack, right? And this is all verbal relations that are happening in our own minds that lead to things like this happening. So we can see where we can get to a point where maladaptive behavior is caused by our own verbal language. And this is the basis of acceptance and commitment therapy, right? The memory of a painful event can actually be can cause more distress than the event itself. For any of you who have been, dabbling in ACT for a long time, you'll know, obviously, ACT is used for a vast variety of treatments like PTSD and anxiety, depression, etc., etc. And sometimes you can see how you think about something and you can be really distressed. I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but if you've ever imagined your own death, or the death of someone that you love, which has never happened and hopefully won't happen for a really long time, you can get really distressed just by being in your own head thinking about that. And that is all our verbal language and relational frames. I do want to say from here, while ACT is definitely used in a psychotherapy context, I am specifically here to talk about acceptance and commitment therapy from a behavior analytic perspective, okay? So I'm not really going to go into the psychotherapy type uses of ACT, which I think is helpful, really, because as behavior analysts, I mean, I think it's getting better, but as behavior analysts, I think there's been a hesitancy to kind of get into this, because we're like, well, we're not psychotherapists. But we don't need to be. This is still an incredible thing for us to know as behavior analysts. Technology is the word I was trying to think of. And to that, there's been a kind of a movement within behavior analysis to using acceptance and commitment training instead of acceptance and commitment therapy. So the article by Little Tarbox and Alzabi in 2020, it actually just came out really recently, kind of goes over that and goes over a little bit of what we're going to be talking about next as well. So put that one on your reading list. So when we're thinking about acceptance and commitment therapy from an ABA perspective, we're still saying that we want to increase psychological flexibility to either change or persist in behavior that's consistent with our values. So we're still talking about behavior. We're still talking about overt behavior. We can either, if something is working for us, in, like I said at the start, in the context of our own lives, then we can persist in that behavior because it's consistent with our values and it's working. But maybe we need to change some aspect of our own verbal behavior to increase psychological flexibility, or obviously a client's verbal behavior. That's probably what's going to be more likely when we're talking about behavior analysts using acceptance and commitment therapy. I do have a little visual of the hexaflex here, but I am going to go over that. I think it's my next slide. Yes, it is. Okay. Even within the context of ABA, it's still important to know the ACT processes. So just to go over this quickly, and I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar with this, but just in case we're not. So present moment awareness is the psychological flexibility, but being really stuck on the past or really stuck in the future is kind of the inflexible repertoire, right? So values, obviously being really clear with your values is one way, and then having a lack of direction is kind of that inflexibility. Same with committed action versus being inactive or stuck. So committed action means that we're taking committed steps towards what we want versus being really stuck or not doing anything. Self as content and self as context and self as content. Also really important. And remember, we were talking about dyactic frames. So you can take a dyactic frame, you can take a family of relational frames and apply that to each one of these. And I said dyactic frames because dyactic frames specifically relate to both past and future and self as content and self as context, right? So when we're thinking about self, I think people struggle a little bit with self as content versus self as context, but basically just what we're talking about is I am a different person dependent on the context of my life that's happening, right? So I'm one person right now, I'm presenter Amanda. When I'm with my friends, I'm friend Amanda. I can be with my family and be a daughter. I can be a wife, right? So there's not just one part of me that defines who I am. There are lots of different parts of me, and I can flexibly adapt depending on the context. Where people get into trouble is thinking that there's just one piece of themselves and it's very rigid, right? And that's self as content, meaning I look at myself, for example, I look at myself as a mother. That's all I am. I'm nothing else. I'm just a mother, and I have to, and obviously if it's a problematic repertoire, it might be I'm not a good mother. And that takes up my whole content. So I'm not being flexible with my sense of self. I'm stuck on one certain thing as myself as content. So that's the inflexible repertoire. Hopefully that makes sense. So when we're thinking about fusion versus diffusion, so fusion is thinking that a thought is real, right? So thinking that because I've thought something, that means that thought is an actual reality. So if I think to myself some days, which I do, I'm not good enough, or I'm stupid, or things like that, that diffusion means that I know that it's just a thought. It doesn't mean that just because I have a thought, it doesn't mean that it's actually true. But where we get into trouble is when we start to think that our thoughts are reality, right? So our brain is telling us all kinds of things and we think it's really real, versus it's just a thought. And then experiential avoidance versus acceptance. So acceptance is being able to pretty much feel the fear and do it anyway kind of thing. Whereas experiential avoidance is avoiding thoughts, aversive thoughts and feelings. From a behavior analytic perspective, we're really good at programming for avoidance, right? We get that, but that's direct contingency avoidance. And what we're talking about is not avoiding the thing, it's avoiding difficult thoughts or feelings, which is a whole nother ballgame. So talking of function, as behavior analysts, all we do is think about function. We think about function, we talk about function. Why does that behavior occur? If you're ever in clinical meetings, you know, when someone's presenting, it's like, well, what's the function of the behavior? Or what's the hypothesized function? So crucially for us, there's no way that we could adopt an acceptance and commitment training framework without thinking about, well, what about function, right? Now, the thing is that ACT has always meant to look at function. That's what the hexaflex was made for. So for those in the therapeutic community, they're like, well, that's what we're talking about when we talk about the hexaflex. We're talking about the why of behavior. For behavior analysts, I think it's important for us to kind of think about expanding our understanding of function. Now, don't get me wrong, I really don't think that everybody only thinks about four functions and that's it. You know, there's a lot of talk of, you know, control as a function and signs of damage as functions. And I think I know that we already have expanded how we think of functions of behavior. But now I think as a science and a field, we need to expand that even more and think about these ACT processes as functions of behavior. So we think of, if we start thinking about covert behavior functions, right? And I went to an amazing workshop run by Tom Szabo and Courtney Tarbox in February. I think it was in February. And this is really where I was even introduced to really thinking about these ACT processes as behavioral functions. And that research article that I mentioned earlier is Little et al. Kind of goes through that as well. So let's dive into it kind of to go over. So basically, if we think of private events as functions of behavior, we can really start addressing those complex behavioral problems that we might not have been able to address before. So as I mentioned, experiential avoidance is avoiding aversive thoughts and feelings, right? So from a behavior analytic perspective, I can say, well, what's my target behavior? My target behavior is, I have a client, and I have a client who avoids feeling bad for a short amount of time, which results in him not being able to contact these longer term reinforcers down the line, right? So avoiding short-term aversives, which result in less contact with large long-term reinforcers. So for my client specifically, he really big reinforcer of his is being with family, but he will not leave his home because he's afraid of feeling nervous around certain stimuli, which I won't get into. But the replacement behavior for him that we're working on is engaging behaviors that contact these aversives, but just for a short time, in order to get you to these longer term reinforcers. And I think as behavior analysts, we can all kind of wrap our heads around that as a description of a function of behavior. So basically, we just want to tolerate the presence of aversive thoughts and feelings and continue to do the things that we want to do despite those thoughts and feelings. And I'm sure we do stuff like that all the time, right? We probably constantly engage with aversive thoughts and feelings, and like I said, feel the fear and do it anyway. So if we think about lack of present moment awareness or focus on the past and future, so this is really, it's really kind of rigid attention to things that we don't have any control over, right? The past has already happened, we can't change it. The future hasn't happened yet, we don't know what's going to happen. And it's really rigid attention to these things. So an inability to orient to the present moment or to relevant stimuli. So if I was writing replacement behaviors for that, it would be attend and respond to relevant stimuli versus this rigid attention to the past that we can't change. And I think a lot of us have probably worked with clients who perseverate, right? We have clients who perseverate on what's going to happen. And that can be really difficult because it's not a behavior, or the function of that behavior may not necessarily be attention or escape. And we're kind of struggling to go, well, I really don't know what the function of this constant perseveration in the future is. well, maybe this is the function, you know. And we'll talk a bit about, please don't skip direct contingency management, but we'll get to that. So another replacement might be just self-management, right? We teach our clients to self-manage all the time. This might be an instance where we do that, and our self-management is going to be, I'm going to manage my own thoughts. I'm going to allow myself to have the thought, but then bring my awareness back to the present moment. And that's a pretty easy thing to write into treatment or a target. For fusion, and I'm not going to go through all of the hexaflex, the ACT processes, but just kind of the more common or important ones that I see in clinical practice, I should say. So fusion, so like I said, believing that all thoughts are true. So the target behavior here might be rigid rule control, right? So it could also involve vocal responses like, I have to, I can't, this is just how it is. I should do this. Well, why? Just because I should. So there's this rigid rule control it's a fusion function, right? We're fused to this rigid rule control, and we're not able to just flexibly adapt to what's necessary. So the replacement behavior might be just weakening that rigid rule control and being able to kind of respond more flexibly. Or in a lot of contexts, I'm working with a 12-year-old right now, and it's more so just understand that the thought is just a thought. You know, just because you have the thought that a bug is going to kill you doesn't mean that a bug is actually going to kill you. And obviously there's a lot that goes before that, but thinking about fusion as a function really, really helped me expand even my own ability to treat this type of problem behavior. And then unclear direction. The unclear values can also involve avoiding something important for the fear of failure. And I think that that's important, particularly probably for some of our older clients. So the target behavior might be just a lack of verbally constructed long-term reinforcers, right? And think about that for a second. Values are verbally constructed reinforcers. Like I will say, one of my values is my family. That's a verbally constructed long-term reinforcer, okay? So I would do things that would be in line with my values because I'm telling myself that that's one of my values. So an inability to tact that direction or purpose might be a target behavior. And then our replacements might be engage with rules for purpose to access those potent delayed reinforcers. Now, I did put on here the presence of augmentals. Tornica et al. Does a good kind of synopsis of what augmentals are. But basically what we're talking about are a presence of, it's almost like these interim statements that are interim verbal rules that can kind of increase the value of delayed conditioned reinforcers. So my own example is, I'll say to myself, fail to prepare to fail. And in a moment, so I know that one of my values is, you know, being good at something or getting something right. And maybe 2 days beforehand, I really would rather eat ice cream and watch Netflix. But then I'll say to myself, okay, Amanda, come on now, fail to prepare to fail. And that's my augmental, which basically immediately evokes a behavior with respect to my value, right? So immediately I'm like, all right, I'm going to go and prepare. And that's in a nutshell what an augmental is. It's a little, of course, with everything with RFT, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But and then obviously just knowing our values and engaging in behaviors that bring us closer to that might be a replacement behavior. And these are all things that we can see and measure, right? I can look at a behavior that a client is engaging in that might be, you know, more in line with their values versus not. So not leaving the house for 6 months is not. Leaving the house to go and see my grandmother is, right? So that's pretty easy to see. And then I think this is the last one. So self as content versus self as context. So if we're thinking about this as a target behavior, we can think of like again a rigid rule, but about who I am or who somebody else is. You know, there's a client, and I think his BCBA might be on here, but there's a client that that we work with, and he has this really, really set way of thinking about who his dad is. So dad is, you know, he's a deadbeat, and he doesn't do anything for our family, and that's just who he is. But he can't be anything else. He's not anything else. That's just all that he is. So this really rigid rule regarding who that person is. You know, in that situation, dad is not fun dad, or dad isn't, you know, the guy who brings me to concerts, or the guy who, you know, has a chat with me over dinner. He's just this one person that's, you know, not good enough in my eyes. So self as content doesn't just have to do with how the client sees themselves, but also how they might see others really rigidly. And that can be pretty problematic. And the replacement behavior is just that flexible perspective taken, right? So I am different people in different contexts, but, you know, in my example, dad can, maybe in some, maybe there's some truth to that in a tiny moment in time in a certain context, but that doesn't mean that's who he is. There's a lot more than that to him. So shifting in an adaptive way and understanding that someone is not just all content. So that's kind of thinking about those private events as functions of behavior. So hopefully for behavior analysts, I think if we start to even if we ever look at a hexaflex and we start thinking, oh, this isn't for me, well, it really is, because we're talking about functions of behavior, and that's what we do, right? We figure out the why of behavior, and then we try and treat it. And to the point of treating, so I'm going to talk a little bit about just training verbal repertoires that may not be fully formed yet, but then also thinking about those kind of problematic behaviors that might be, you know, that the function might be a little bit more covert. So 2 books that I absolutely love are, so the Derived Relational Respondent book by Rayfelt and Barnes-Holmes. So if you have a young learner who you're kind of, you've done the VB map, and there's a lot of kind of splinter skills, and you're not really sure, you know, what the issue might be. If you really understand how complex language occurs, like I talked about in my much earlier slides, then you understand the importance of derived relational responding and things like A or R, arbitrarily applicable relational responding, to acquiring complex language. So if we think about those processes, then we can think to myself, well, I can teach that, and maybe if I teach that, then my learner who might have deficient verbal repertoires can catch up and have more complex language, right? So in chapter 8 of that Barnes-Holmes and Rayfelt book, actually, they talk about the earliest generalized relational operands and teach you how to teach them, but the whole book is chock full of how to teach from start to finish complex language for learners with autism and developmental disabilities. And then the Freiling, Rayfelt, Tarbox and Hayes book. This is a newer book. I'm pretty sure it's 2020. I have the reference in my reference section, but this is like the white book for RFT, right? It's everything that you need to know about relational frame theory in one book, and complex language and how we account for complex language. Chapter 10 goes through designing instruction using stimulus equivalence, right? So we start with design and instruction using stimulus equivalence, and we can teach all these crucial behaviors and teach these crucial verbal repertoires. Chapter 11, teaching complex relational operands of analogy and hierarchy, etc., etc. So I think somebody had asked me once, well, why would we teach complex verbal repertoires if the probability is that then they'll be problematic? And I definitely understand the question, because we're kind of shifting between talking about verbal repertoires and then talking about how it can become problematic. But just remember for a second that the population of learners that we work with, our whole aim is to get our learners to where they are, they're functioning at the level of their typical peers. Not everybody, in fact, it's not extremely likely that we're going to teach problematic repertoires. We're just going to teach full verbal repertoires with things like this. And I think that that's really valuable, just to have that understanding, that deeper understanding of verbal language, and then being able to teach that. The PEAK training system, relational training system, assessment and training system, is really awesome as well. We use that at Firefly. And the reason why this is kind of, well, in my opinion, superior to a lot of the other kind of assessment and teaching systems is that it takes you the whole way through. So the direct training module can look relatively similar to something like the VB-MAP might look like, but then it takes you all the way through to generalization, equivalence, and then transformation. And now we have a really strong understanding what transformation is. Some of the training in the training systems and the goals in the transformation module get pretty complex. So you can teach to a really high level. You can teach really complex verbal language there. Okay, and then so when we're thinking about interventions for some of the more complex kind of verbal language, there's a couple of really good resources. The AIM curriculum is a really good resource. So mindfulness, ABA, includes daily lessons. They actually also have a children with psychological flexibility questionnaire. So it's kind of like an assessment. This is one that I did on a client of mine October last year, and it's really easy. So if you go to the AIM website, they actually have the fillable form there, and it will calculate the subtotals for you, which is really great. But it's just a really good resource to use, because so in this example, you can see that my client is definitely struggling more with acceptance and diffusion than things like present moment. And when I finished that assessment, I was like, wow, well, that hit the nail on the head. But it was just the kind of, sometimes we do assessments even when we already know what the function is, right? But it was a great addition to the analysis. The Thrive in Adolescent, or the DNAV curriculum, has also been an absolute game changer for me in terms of intervention for some of these more complex behaviors. So I'm currently working with a client, and he's the fusion client who has the thought that a bug is going to kill him, so thinks that a bug is actually going to kill him. And using this, thinking about being a noticer and notice that I'm having the thought, that it's just really applicable and usable for our younger clients on the spectrum. So in terms talking of intervention, we really don't ever want to skip direct contingency management. So I want to make that really clear, right? There's no reason to start getting into more complex interventions and start thinking about the ACT processes as functions of behavior if direct contingency management is working just fine. My caveat to that, obviously, is like, we still, as behavior analysts, we still have a responsibility to understand complex language and teach that if we can. But when we're talking about those covert processes potentially as functions, that's when we're like, okay, well, this is not just avoidance. This is experiential avoidance. They're not just avoiding actual things. They're avoiding aversive thoughts and feelings about things. Ultimately, the goal is to produce socially significant, observable, measurable behavior change. And that's what we want to do, right? And we can do that if we have all of those tools in our toolbox. So what's next is just lots of research. I feel really lucky to be where we're at right now with these technologies. There's not a ton of research on ACT application within ABA, so I think it's important that we continue to do that. Right now, I'm part of a research team that are looking specifically at thinking about, functional analysis, to be able to kind of streamline that a little bit so that the processes all seem way more applicable to behavior analysts as well. And really just broadening the applicability and effectiveness of ABA as a whole. A lot of people do ask, and I know I'm running short on time, but I think this is my last slide. A lot of people do have kind of some worries about scope of practice, right? And it's completely understandable. But hopefully from today, you'll see that none of this is really out, it's not a million miles from what we know already. These are all things that we know. These are things, you know, especially if you get the grasp of the RFT stuff and the kind of complex verbal behavior, then you're halfway there in terms of these things already being in your repertoire. Some things that we can obviously do to increase our scope of practice. The Behavioral Observations has a ton of ACT type podcasts. So podcasts, articles, the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science, JCBS, puts out articles on RFT and ACT all the time. So if you're interested and you don't have access, I recommend that for sure. Online trainings, so there's always a lot of online training availability as well, which is great to increase scope practice. And then attending workshops. So boot camps, praxis, connections, behavior planning, they have a lot. And I don't necessarily endorse any of the things that I've just talked about, but these are all just really, really valuable resources that I found useful, so I wanted to kind of share. Again, the boot camp that it was ACT for High Functioning Autism boot camp that I went to in February was unbelievably valuable. So I think these are all the ways that we can kind of increase our scope of practice and then feel like acceptance and commitment training and relational frame theory is something that we can absolutely do. And there are my references. Thank you everybody so much for hanging in there, and hopefully everybody followed along pretty well and I didn't talk too fast.